Napoleon didn't just conquer Europe, he turned it into a revenue machine. Kingdoms marched under his shadow. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers crossed borders with precise coordination. Monarchies fell, treaties were signed, maps were redrawn. But behind the battlefield, things were much colder and more calculated. Napoleon created a system where Europe paid for its own subjugation. When he seized power in 1799, Napoleon controlled lands from Spain to Poland and from the North Sea to southern Italy. At one point, the Grand Army numbered over 600,000 soldiers. Supplying, arming, and paying such a force required enormous resources. Yet here is the paradox. France was not a wealthy country. It was financially exhausted and drowning in debt. By the late 1780s, the French monarchy was in serious trouble. The 7 Years' War and support for the American Revolution had loaded the state with billions of francs in debt. By 1788, just paying the interest consumed more than half of royal revenues. The monarchy fell not because of ideology, but because it could not pay its bills. After the Revolution, things became even more chaotic. In 1790, the revolutionaries issued assignments, paper money backed by church lands. At first, it seemed smart: convert property into cash, inject liquidity into the economy. But the government printed too much money. Inflation spiraled, the currency collapsed, prices soared, savings evaporated, and trust disappeared. France experienced something close to hyperinflation. This was the country Napoleon inherited, a nation drained by internal terror, economic instability, and war against multiple European coalitions. He quickly realized something essential: you cannot wage continuous war on a collapsing monetary system. His first step was not conquest, it was stabilization. In 1800, he founded the Bank of France. In 1803, he introduced the franc germana, a currency backed by gold and silver. Tax collection became centralized, bureaucracy modernized, corruption reduced, state accounts brought under tighter control. Within France, he ran a surprisingly disciplined system. Budgets were often balanced, and revenues became predictable. But Napoleon did not want the French people to bear the full cost of continuous war, so he shifted the bill outward. After each major victory, he demanded financial contributions from defeated states. In 1805, after defeating Austria at the Battle of Austerlitz, the Treaty of Pressburg required Austria to pay 40 million francs. In 1807, after defeating Prussia, the Treaty of Tilsit imposed contributions estimated at around 120 million francs. To put this into perspective, France's annual military spending at the time hovered around 600 to 700 million francs. A single contribution could cover several months of military operations. Napoleon's model was brutal but efficient. Conquer territory, demand contributions, station French troops at the expense of the occupied state, extract cash, grain, and supplies, and fund the next campaign. War financed war. German states provided troops and money. Italy financed French garrisons. Holland carried heavy burdens, and Spain, before rebelling, was drawn into the system. This was not haphazard looting, it was structured extraction. But the system had a limit. It required constant expansion. As long as France kept winning, new revenue streams opened. Every victory financed the next campaign. Once expansion stalled, the financial obligations remained. Napoleon did not rely on contributions alone. He also forced cities and states to lend money to the French administration. Conscription provided soldiers, but financing supplied everything else. In 1806, after failing to defeat Britain at sea, he attempted to damage it economically through the Continental System. But European economies were deeply tied to British trade, so the strategy ended up hurting the continent. Smuggling increased, Trade routes were disrupted, and industries in some regions suffered. Russia, unable to handle the strain, began breaking the system. Then came the disaster of 1812, the invasion of Russia. With 600,000 soldiers, it was the largest European army ever assembled, and financially catastrophic. Supply lines stretched thousands of kilometers, losses were enormous, and fewer than 100,000 soldiers returned. There was no revenue from victory, only cost. After Russia, France could no longer turn military success into cash. That is when the full financial burden returned home. Napoleon's disciplined fiscal management only worked while external resources covered much of the cost. Compare this to Britain, whose approach was fundamentally different. Instead of relying on contributions, Britain financed the war through long-term debt. Investors trusted government bonds, and the Bank of England and Parliament ensured stability. Britain's debt reached over 200% of the country's total economic output by 1815, yet it remained manageable. Napoleon's system was dynamic but fragile. Britain's was slower but scalable. By 1814, when Napoleon abdicated, Europe began to rebuild. Now France had to pay indemnities, and the system had reversed. But the lesson was clear. Military power without financial sustainability is fragile. Napoleon was not financially reckless. He stabilized the currency, modernized administration, and improved tax collection. But his strategy assumed that victory would always generate revenue. Once expansion stopped, the system collapsed. Britain, thanks to strong capital markets, endured. Today, the United States plays a role somewhat similar to Britain in 1815. It controls the dominant reserve currency, has deep financial markets, and issues reliable government bonds. This gives it enormous flexibility, but only as long as credibility holds. If trust fails, the costs return home. Napoleon learned this the hard way. Modern economies do not rely on tribute, but they do depend on growth, global demand for debt, and confidence in institutions. Napoleon's empire was spectacular, fast, and innovative, but it required motion. When motion stopped, the bill came due. History does not punish ambition, it punishes unsustainable financing. The Napoleonic era was not just about cannons and cavalry, it was about balance sheets and bond markets. The real empire wasn't the one with the most land, it was the one that controlled credit.